Arizona 2019, a land where ancient spirits and modern struggles coexist across sun-scorched plateaus and deep, shadow-filled canyons. For 38-year-old Jack Harrison, the sprawling wilderness of the Painted Desert represented escape, a chance to rebuild his life after losing everything in the economic crash that had stripped him of his architectural firm in Phoenix, his marriage, and nearly his will to live. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dilapidated cabin he'd purchased with his remaining savings sat on 20 acres of isolated land, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and 30 from the closest town. To most, it would seem a desperate last resort. To Jack, it was the only option that made sense after the crowded courtrooms, the creditors' calls, and the pitying glances from former colleagues. No one could have foreseen the mystical convergence of events that awaited him in the shadow of those ancient mesas. Before we venture deeper into this extraordinary tale, know that some stories defy conventional understanding, challenging us to open our minds to possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. The mid-January wind cut across the plateau with bitter determination as Jack finished splitting the day's firewood. 4 months in this harsh landscape had transformed him physically. His once soft hands, now calloused and strong, his formerly trim architect's physique hardened by daily labor. His dark hair, now longer than he'd ever worn it, was pulled back. In a simple band, his face weathered by sun and wind. Dawn had broken 3 hours earlier, the sky transitioning from deep indigo to the clear, sharp blue that made the distant red rock formations appear painted against an artist's canvas. Jack worked methodically, the rhythmic swing of the axe creating a meditation of sorts, each strike cleaving another piece of pine for the hungry stove that kept the desert's freezing night temperatures at bay. His dog, Rusty, a mix of shepherd, and something undefined he'd rescued from a shelter in Flagstaff, lay nearby, occasionally raising his head at unfamiliar sounds, before settling back into contented observation. The animal had proven an unexpectedly perfect companion for this solitary existence, asking nothing but offering constant, uncomplicated presence. "Almost done, boy," Jack called, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Rusty's ears perked up at his voice, tail thumping against the dust. 4 more logs split, and he'd have enough to last through another night of temperatures that would plunge well below freezing once the sun abandoned the desert to darkness. Jack paused, stretching his back as he surveyed his surroundings. The isolation that had initially drawn him here sometimes weighed heavily, particularly in moments when the vastness of the landscape seemed to emphasize the smallness of his existence. Yet there was a peace in this place that had begun to heal something within him, a reconnection to a more essential way of being that had been lost in the frantic pace of his former life. His cabin, really more of a primitive homestead than anything deserving the name, sat nestled against a low mesa, its weathered wood and stone construction blending into the landscape as if it had grown organically from the earth itself. A small garden plot lay dormant for winter, waiting for spring's return to yield the modest crops that supplemented his monthly supply runs. Solar panels, his one significant investment, provided enough electricity for basic needs, while a well tapped into the underground water table that had sustained indigenous peoples in this region for thousands of years. It wasn't sophisticated, but it worked, allowing him a level of self-sufficiency that had become increasingly important after the collapse of his previous life. Jack was gathering the split wood when Rusty suddenly leapt to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's gaze fixed on the eastern path that wound through a stand of juniper trees toward the broader desert beyond, his posture alert but not aggressive. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, picking up his axe more from habit than any real sense of threat. Few people ventured this far from established roads without purpose, and unexpected visitors were rare enough to merit caution. At first, he saw nothing beyond the twisted junipers and scattered sage. Then movement caught his eye, a figure emerging slowly from the path, walking with the measured pace of someone conserving energy over long distances. As the visitor drew closer, Jack could make out an elderly Navajo man, perhaps in his 70s, dressed in a curious blend of traditional and contemporary clothing. A worn denim jacket covered a more traditional woven shirt, while his weathered brown hat, neither Western nor particularly indigenous in style, bore a single eagle feather secured with a band of red cloth. He carried a walking stick, adorned with symbols Jack didn't recognize, and a small leather pack hung from one shoulder. Rusty's growl subsided, replaced by curious observation as the stranger approached without hesitation or apparent concern for the dog's initial warning. There was something in his bearing that spoke of familiarity with the land, in ways Jack recognized he himself would never fully achieve, despite his attempts at adaptation. "Hello there," Jack called, setting down the axe and taking a few steps. "Forward. You're a long way from anywhere." The elder continued his approach, his dark eyes, surprisingly sharp in his weathered face, studying Jack with unabashed interest. When he spoke, his voice carried the textured quality of age, but with an underlying strength that belied his years. "The anywhere I seek is here," he replied, his English clear but carrying the subtle cadence of someone for whom it was not a first language. "I am Joseph Begay, walking the remembering path." Jack wasn't entirely sure what the remembering path meant, but the directness of the introduction seemed to warrant similar straightforwardness in return. "Jack Harrison," he offered, extending his hand after a moment of hesitation. "This is my place, though I'm still new to the area myself." Joseph accepted the handshake, his grip firm despite hands that showed the distinctive knotting of arthritis. "New to your eyes, perhaps," he said with a faint smile, "but not new to your spirit, or you would not have remained through the first cold season." The observation caught Jack off guard. It carried a presumption of knowledge about him that seemed impossible for a stranger, yet held enough truth to disturb his usual composure. Before he could respond, Rusty approached the elder, all earlier suspicion gone, and pressed against the man's leg in an uncharacteristic display of immediate trust. Joseph reached down to stroke the dog's head. "Good protector," he commented. "Sees with true eyes." A gust of wind swept across the clearing, unusually biting even for January, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching snow. A relative rarity in this part of Arizona, but not unheard of at these elevations. "Storm comes," Joseph observed, glancing toward the northwest where clouds had begun to gather at the horizon. 3 days of wind and cold. The road back to town will not welcome travelers." Jack followed his gaze, recognizing the telltale signs of a weather system moving in faster than the morning's clear skies had suggested. The forecast he'd checked via his satellite internet 2 days earlier had mentioned only a slight chance of precipitation, but desert weather was notoriously unpredictable, especially in the transitional seasons. "You have somewhere nearby to wait it out?" Jack asked, surprising himself with the concern he felt for this stranger who had appeared as suddenly as the changing weather. Joseph's expression revealed nothing beyond a calm acceptance. "The path I walk goes where it must," he said simply. "Today it has led here." The implication was clear, if unstated. The elderly man had no particular destination, at least not one that would provide shelter from the approaching storm. Jack found himself facing an unexpected moral dilemma. His cabin was small, his supplies calculated for one, and the privacy of his isolation had become a jealously guarded aspect of his new existence. Yet leaving an elderly man to face a winter storm alone in the desert was unthinkable. "You're welcome to wait out the weather here," he offered, gesturing toward the cabin. "It's not much, but it's solid and warm." For a long moment, Joseph studied him with those penetrating dark eyes, as if assessing something far deeper than the simple offer of shelter. Then he nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "I accept your fire," he said, using what Jack would later learn was a traditional expression referring to more than just physical warmth, but to the broader concept of hospitality and protection. As they walked the short distance to the cabin, Jack was struck by how naturally the elder moved through the landscape, each step placed with a sureness that spoke of intimate familiarity. With this type of terrain, it contrasted sharply with Jack's own still-developing relationship with the land, despite his months of residence. Inside, the cabin revealed the sparse functionality of Jack's existence. A main room served as both living area and kitchen, dominated by a wood stove that provided heat and cooking capability. A small desk held his laptop and satellite phone, tenuous connections to the world he'd left behind. A doorway led to a single bedroom, while a basic bathroom had been added sometime in the cabin's long history, modernized with a composting toilet and solar-heated water system. What the space lacked in luxury, it made up for in thoughtful efficiency. Every item served a purpose. Nothing was wasted or superfluous. Jack had found unexpected satisfaction in this streamlined way of living after years surrounded by the trappings of success that had ultimately provided little comfort when his life collapsed. "Coffee?" Jack offered, gesturing for Joseph to take the more comfortable of the two chairs near the stove while he stoked the fire with fresh wood. "Thank you," the elder replied, setting his walking stick carefully against the wall before removing his hat to reveal silver hair pulled back in a traditional Navajo bun. Now, in the better light of the cabin, Jack could see the intricate patterns of lines that mapped Joseph's face, each one seeming to tell of decades lived close to the elements. As Jack busied himself with the familiar routine of preparing coffee, on the stovetop, an unexpected ease settled between them, the silence comfortable rather than strained. Rusty circled once, before settling at Joseph's feet, the dog's usual wariness of strangers completely absent. "You have been here since late summer," Joseph said eventually. It wasn't a question. Jack paused, the coffee pot hovering above the burner. "How did you know that?" A slight smile touched the elder's lips. "The garden shows first planting, not established growth. The woodpile has the organization of someone who learned its importance recently. And the path from your door to the outhouse is not yet worn deep by many passing feet." The observations were so simple yet accurate that Jack felt a flash of embarrassment at his surprise. Of course, someone familiar with this way of life would read such signs easily. He'd been living in isolation so long he'd forgotten how transparent certain things might be to knowledgeable eyes. "I bought the place in August," he confirmed, returning his attention to the coffee. "Needed a change after everything fell apart in Phoenix." "Ah," Joseph nodded. "The city of the bird that burns. To be reborn, a good place to leave when seeking a new path." Jack wasn't sure if the elder was making a poetic reference to Phoenix's namesake or offering some deeper observation, but the words resonated uncomfortably with his own unspoken feelings about his former home. He poured the coffee into two mismatched mugs, offering one to Joseph before settling into the second chair. "So what brings you out this way?" Jack asked, steering the conversation away from himself. "You mentioned a remembering path?" Joseph cradled the mug in his hands, seeming to appreciate the warmth as much as the drink itself. "I walk the routes. My grandfather taught me," he explained. "The old ways between sacred places that our people have traveled for generations. Modern roads and boundaries have covered many, but the land remembers, even when people forget." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "Every few years I make this journey, not for ceremony that others would recognize, but as a personal remembering. The land speaks differently to those who listen while moving across it slowly, on foot, the way our ancestors did. The concept struck Jack as simultaneously foreign and oddly familiar. As an architect, he'd always been sensitive to how spaces spoke to those who inhabited them, how the right design could evoke emotional responses beyond conscious awareness. Perhaps this was not so different. Just on a scale far grander than any human construction. Must be hard going, especially at... Jack hesitated, not wanting to be impolite about the man's age. At 76, Joseph supplied a hint of amusement. Yes, each journey becomes more difficult than the last, but also more necessary. The wind outside had intensified, rattling the cabin's windows with sudden gusts that suggested the storm was advancing faster than either of them had anticipated. Rusty's ears twitched at the sound, but the dog remained contentedly at Joseph's feet. "Looks like you made the right call seeking shelter," Jack observed, rising to check the woodpile inside the cabin. He'd need to bring in more from the stack. Outside, before the weather deteriorated further, Joseph watched him with quiet attention. "The path shows what is needed if we pay attention," he said. "Today, it showed me your fire when protection was required." There was something in the way he said it, not as if he had been wandering and fortunately stumbled upon Jack's cabin, but rather as if some greater purpose had guided their meeting. Under normal circumstances, Jack would have dismissed such, thinking as superstitious or, at best, the result of finding patterns in random events. But after months in the desert's vast silence, his certainty about many things had begun to shift. "Well, I'm glad you found your way here," he said simply, surprising himself with how genuinely he meant it. The prospect of company through the approaching storm no longer seemed an imposition, but rather an unexpected gift after long isolation. As the day progressed, the storm arrived with impressive force. What began as wind escalated to include sleet, that transitioned to heavy snow by early afternoon. Unusual weather for the region, but not unprecedented in January at this elevation. Jack made several trips to secure additional firewood and check his solar setup before the accumulation made outdoor movement difficult. During these preparations, Joseph remained by the stove, occasionally rising to study the books and a few personal items Jack had brought to his desert refuge. He showed particular interest in the architectural sketches pinned to one wall, designs Jack had created during sleepless nights, buildings that would never be constructed but served as creative exercises to maintain the skills that had once defined his professional identity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You speak with structure," Joseph observed when Jack returned from his final trip outside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. "These forms have voice." Jack stamped snow from his boots before responding. "I used to be an architect," he explained, the admission coming easier than he expected. "Designed buildings in Phoenix for 15 years before everything collapsed." "The buildings fell?" Joseph asked, his expression suggesting he understood this was not the literal meaning. "No, my business did. Poor investments, a market crash, some bad decisions." Jack shrugged, the simplified explanation barely skimming the surface of the catastrophic series of events that had decimated his professional and personal life. "Ended up bankrupt, divorced, and with nothing to show for all those years of work." Joseph nodded slowly, returning his attention to the sketches. "So you came to the desert to find new designs." It wasn't how Jack would have described his retreat to isolation, but something about the framing resonated. "I suppose I did," he acknowledged, "though I'm not sure what I'm designing now. Just trying to build a different kind of life, I guess." "The most important creation," Joseph said, tapping his chest, "happens here." The conversation shifted to practical matters as Jack prepared a simple meal of bean stew and cornbread. Humble fare, but warming and appropriate for the weather that now enveloped the cabin in white isolation. They ate in companionable silence, the howling wind and occasional crackle from the stove providing natural punctuation to the quiet. As evening descended, bringing with it a darkness made more absolute by the storm, Jack arranged bedding on the small couch for Joseph, offering his own room instead, but accepting when the elder declined, saying he preferred to sleep near the fire. "Been a long time since I had a guest out here," Jack said, adjusting the damper on the stove to maintain heat through the night. "Actually, you're the first." Joseph settled onto the couch, his movements revealing the stiffness that often accompanies age but maintaining a dignity that impressed Jack. "The desert tests before it welcomes," the elder observed. "You have passed its first examination by surviving until winter. Now comes the deeper learning." "What's that?" Jack asked, genuinely curious despite his natural skepticism toward philosophical pronouncements. "Learning that true survival is never accomplished alone," Joseph replied, his gaze steady. "The land knows this. Our ancestors knew this. Modern people often forget until circumstances remember them." The words lingered in Jack's mind as he retired to his bedroom, Rusty following to take his usual place at the foot of the bed. Through the small window, nothing was visible beyond swirling white as the storm claimed the desert, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and dangerous. For the first time in months, Jack fell asleep with the awareness of another human presence nearby, an awareness that should have felt like an intrusion into his carefully constructed solitude, but instead provided an unexpected comfort. His last conscious thought before drifting off was to wonder what circumstances had remembered him and why the universe had sent Joseph Begay to his doorstep on this of all days. He could not have imagined how completely that question would be answered when morning came. Jack woke to an unfamiliar silence. The howling wind that had accompanied him to sleep had vanished, replaced by a stillness so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. Rusty was already alert, standing at the bedroom door with unusual intensity, neither barking nor whining, but clearly eager to be let out. The quality of light filtering through his small window was different, brighter, yet somehow diffuse, reflecting the distinctive luminosity that only comes from sunlight on fresh snow. Jack pulled on an extra layer before emerging from his bedroom, immediately noticing that the main room was empty. The blankets on the couch were neatly folded, but Joseph was nowhere to be seen. "Joseph?" he called, receiving no answer. The wood stove still radiated heat, evidence that someone had added fuel recently. A small pot of coffee percolated on its surface, clearly prepared by hands other than his own. These domestic signs made the absence of their creator all the more puzzling. Rusty scratched at the front door with increasing urgency. When Jack finally opened it, he was momentarily blinded by the brilliance outside. The desert landscape had been utterly transformed. What had been red earth and scattered vegetation now lay beneath a blanket of pristine white, 8 inches deep and unmarked by any footprints or disturbances, a geological impossibility for this region, yet undeniably present. "Joseph?" Jack called again, his voice absorbed by the snow-muffled air. Rusty bounded out, immediately plunging into the powder with exuberant leaps. The dog's path created the first disruption in the perfect whiteness stretching in every direction. Jack stepped onto his small porch, the cold immediately penetrating his indoor footwear. That's when he saw it. To the right of his cabin door, partially sheltered by the porch's modest overhang, stood an object that had definitely not been there. The previous night, a carved wooden pole approximately 4 feet tall had been set firmly in the earth, its surface adorned with intricate symbols and figures that emerged organically from the grain of the wood itself. At its top perched a meticulously carved hawk, wings partially extended as if preparing for flight. From the hawk's outstretched talons hung a small leather pouch decorated with beadwork in geometric patterns of turquoise and white. Jack stared at the object, trying to process its sudden appearance. There were no footprints approaching or leading. Away from it, as if it had materialized directly from the snow-covered ground or been placed there before the snowfall, which he knew was impossible. He'd secured the cabin himself after Joseph had settled on the couch. Rusty returned to the porch, sniffing curiously at the totem, but showing none of the alarm Jack might have expected from his normally protective companion. The dog's acceptance of the mysterious object only deepened Jack's confusion. Cautiously, Jack approached the carving, noting the extraordinary craftsmanship evident in every detail. The wood had been worked with remarkable skill, each symbol flowing into the next, in ways that suggested years of practice. The hawk's features captured not just anatomical accuracy, but a sense of living spirit, its eyes inlaid with what appeared to be small pieces of polished obsidian that caught the morning light with unsettling awareness. "What the hell?" Jack murmured. Reaching out to touch the smooth surface, the wood felt unusually warm beneath his fingertips, despite the freezing temperature. Not the ambient warmth of an object recently brought from indoors, but something that seemed to generate heat from within. He pulled his hand back instinctively, the sensation both foreign and vaguely disquieting. Looking more closely at the symbols carved into the pole's length, Jack recognized stylized elements that resembled lightning, mountains, and what might be flowing water, interspersed with more abstract designs he couldn't begin to interpret. Nothing about the object suggested mass production or tourist craft. This was clearly something of cultural significance, created by skilled hands for specific purpose. Jack circled the totem, searching for any hint of how it had appeared or who had placed it. The unbroken snow surrounding the cabin provided no answers, only an emphatic confirmation of the impossibility of the situation. His gaze swept the broader landscape, seeking any sign of Joseph or indication of another human presence, but the desert offered only pristine whiteness, stretching to the distant mesas. Returning inside, partly from the cold and partly from a growing sense of unease, Jack poured himself a cup of the coffee Joseph had apparently prepared before his unexplained disappearance. Its rich aroma carried unfamiliar notes, earthier and more complex than Jack's usual brew, despite being made from his own supplies. He tried to organize his thoughts logically. The simplest explanation was that Joseph had risen before dawn, carved the totem from wood Jack hadn't noticed in his supplies, placed it outside and then departed, somehow without leaving tracks in the fresh snow. Each element of this scenario seemed more implausible than the last, particularly given the elaborate nature of the carving, which would have required specialized tools and considerable time. The alternative explanations ventured into territory Jack's rational mind resisted, realms of supernatural occurrence or hallucination. He'd been living alone too long, perhaps, his isolation finally manifesting as perceptual distortions, yet Rusty clearly saw the totem too, had investigated it with canine thoroughness. Jack's contemplation was interrupted by a distinctive vibration from his satellite phone, a rare occurrence given how few people had the number and how selectively he responded to outside communication. The device showed a text message from his only regular contact, Martin Chen, a supply runner who delivered necessities to remote homesteads throughout the region. Road to your place completely snowed in. County says no clearing for at least 3 days. You good for supplies? Jack texted an affirmative response, confirming what Joseph had predicted the previous day about the storm's impact. The mention of 3 days struck him as a curious echo of the elder's specific forecast. Setting aside the phone, Jack returned to the more immediate mystery. Finishing his coffee, he dressed properly for the conditions outside, insulated boots, heavy coat, gloves, and ventured out for a more thorough inspection of his property. The snow had transformed familiar landmarks into softened alien forms. His woodpile resembled a row of white-capped mushrooms. The dormant garden plot had vanished completely beneath the uniform blanket. Jack walked a complete perimeter around the cabin, maintaining a 20-yard distance to cover the most likely path anyone would take arriving or departing. The snow remained unbroken except for his and Rusty's tracks. He expanded his search to include the path leading toward the main road, then the alternative route that connected to a game trail leading deeper into the desert. Nothing. No human. Tracks, no indication of Joseph's departure route. It was as if the Navajo elder had simply vanished, or had never been there at all. By midday, Jack had exhausted both his search options and his rational explanations. He returned to the cabin, snowmelt dripping from his coat as the day's sun began to assert itself against the frigid air. Rusty followed, seemingly unconcerned by the mystery that consumed his human companion. Jack stood before the totem again, studying it with renewed focus. The small leather pouch hanging from the hawk's talons drew his particular attention now. It was approximately the size of his palm, secured with a drawstring of sinew and decorated with a beadwork pattern that seemed both decorative and significant. Concentric, circles of blue and white surrounding a central motif resembling a stylized sun. After a moment's hesitation, Jack carefully untied the pouch from its mounting. It felt heavier than its size suggested, containing something solid, yet not entirely rigid. A folded paper protruded slightly from the top, visible once he loosened the drawstring. Jack extracted the note, unfolding a single page covered in neat, precise handwriting. The hawk sees what remains hidden to those who walk only on the ground. Your path has kept you earthbound for too long. The desert has begun your healing, but some wounds close only when reopened first. 3 days. Watch with new eyes. Listen with inner ears. What is buried will surface. J.B. The cryptic message only deepened Jack's confusion. He reached into the pouch, his fingers encountering a smooth, curved object. Withdrawing it carefully, he found himself holding a stone pendant on a leather cord. A flat, oval riverstone, polished to gentle smoothness, with markings etched into its surface in patterns similar to some found on the totem. Jack turned the pendant over in his palm, noting how the morning light caught subtle variations in the stones. Coloration, predominantly a deep rust red, with veins of darker material running through it like frozen lightning. The stone's weight felt somehow grounding, as if it carried more than just physical mass. Uncertain what to make of the gift, if that's what it was, Jack returned to the cabin's interior. The day stretched before him with unexpected emptiness. Now that the mystery of Joseph's disappearance had reached a dead end, usually Jack filled his hours with practical tasks, maintenance work, chopping wood, minor improvements to the cabin's systems. Today, however, he felt a peculiar reluctance to engage with these familiar routines. Instead, he found himself drawn to the small bookshelf where he kept the few volumes he'd brought from his previous life. Architectural references mostly, with some southwestern history and a field guide to desert flora and fauna. On impulse, he selected a book he'd acquired but never opened, Navajo Culture and Symbolism, purchased during his initial supply run to help him better understand the indigenous context of the land he now occupied. The afternoon passed in unexpected absorption as Jack paged through descriptions of Navajo cosmology, ceremonial practices, and artistic traditions. The material was dense, academic in places, but sparked connections to his brief interaction with Joseph and the mysterious totem now standing sentinel outside his door. He learned that hawks held special significance in Navajo tradition, often associated with vision, both literal and spiritual, and with messages from the spirit world. Totems, while not a traditional Navajo practice in the form he'd seen, were not entirely foreign to indigenous southwestern traditions, particularly in marking significant locations or events. Most intriguing were the sections on Navajo understanding of time and space, concepts that differed profoundly from Western linear perspectives. The book described a worldview where past, present, and future existed in more permeable relationship, where physical distance could be less significant than spiritual proximity. As daylight began to fade, Jack's reading was interrupted by a sound. So unexpected it took him moments to identify. His landline phone, a relic of the cabin's previous owner that he had never disconnected but that almost never rang. He crossed to the ancient wall-mounted unit, lifting the receiver with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Hello?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty from disuse in the day's solitude. Static crackled for several seconds before a voice emerged, distant and breaking up, but recognizable as human. "Harrison, this is Chen, emergency situation to road near you. Martin?" "You're breaking up," Jack replied, pressing the receiver closer. The connection cleared momentarily. "Stranded travelers, hypothermia risk, coordinates. Closer to you than town." The line went dead. Jack redialed immediately, but received only a continuous busy signal. He tried Martin's mobile number on his satellite phone, but got no response. Not surprising, given the spotty coverage in the area, especially during adverse weather. Jack pulled up his GPS mapping system on his laptop, trying to make sense of the fragmented message. If Martin had been referring to the main access road that eventually connected to Jack's property, there were several points where travelers could become stranded, particularly in unusual snow conditions like those currently blanketing the region. The dying light outside his window emphasized the urgency of the situation. Nighttime temperatures would plunge well below freezing, potentially lethal for anyone stranded without adequate shelter or supplies. Whatever mysterious circumstances surrounded Joseph's appearance and disappearance, the immediate reality demanded action. Jack gathered emergency supplies, extra blankets, a thermos of hot broth, first aid materials, spare clothing, into his most durable backpack. He checked his emergency locator beacon, a concession to his sister's insistence when he'd first moved to such an isolated location, and ensured it was functioning properly. Rusty watched these preparations with growing excitement, clearly anticipating an expedition. Jack hesitated, weighing the risks of bringing the dog against the potential advantages of his keen senses and protective instincts. He decided Rusty's tracking abilities might prove essential if the stranded travelers had moved from their vehicle seeking shelter. As Jack stepped onto the porch, preparing to set out, his gaze fell once more on the totem. The hawk's obsidian eyes seemed to follow his movements with uncanny awareness in the gathering dusk. On impulse, he returned to retrieve the stone pendant from where he'd left it on the table, slipping the leather cord around his neck. The stone settled against his chest, surprisingly warm against his skin, despite the cool interior of the cabin. A trick of his imagination, surely, yet the sensation provided an odd comfort as he prepared to venture into the dangerous conditions outside. The snow had developed a crust in the afternoon sun, now refreezing as temperatures dropped with the setting sun. Jack's boots crunched through this surface with each step, creating echoing sounds in the profound silence of the snow-covered desert. He had decided to follow the most direct route to the main road, reasoning that stranded travelers would most likely be found there rather than on the more obscure back trails. Rusty bounded ahead, periodically returning to check on Jack's progress or investigate interesting scents beneath the snow. The dog's enthusiasm for the expedition contrasted sharply with the gravity of their purpose, yet Jack found himself drawing strength from the animal's uncomplicated engagement with the moment. As twilight deepened toward true darkness, Jack activated his high-powered flashlight, its beam creating stark contrasts across the transformed landscape. The familiar terrain had become alien under its white covering, landmarks altered or obliterated entirely. He relied increasingly on his GPS unit, checking their position against his mental map of the territory. They had covered perhaps a mile when Rusty suddenly froze, ears forward, body tensed in alertness rather than aggression. Jack paused, following. The dogs gazed toward a shallow depression, about 50 yards off their path. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just another snow-covered hollow in the undulating desert floor. Then a subtle movement caught his eye, something darker than the surrounding whiteness, shifting slightly against the wind's direction. Jack adjusted his course, approaching cautiously while keeping the flashlight beam directed at the anomaly. As the distance closed, the shape resolved into a human figure huddled against a rock outcropping, partially covered by snow. Evidence. They had been there for some time. Rusty reached the person first, circling and sniffing with concerned curiosity, but showing no signs of perceived threat. "Hello?" Jack called, increasing his pace. "Are you all right?" The figure stirred, raising a head previously tucked against drawn-up knees. The flashlight revealed a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with copper skin and dark hair crusted with ice crystals. Her face showed the alarming pallor of developing hypothermia despite her naturally darker complexion, lips tinged blue in the harsh, artificial light. "Help," she managed weakly. "My brother... still in the car?" Jack knelt beside her, quickly assessing her condition. Her clothing, jeans, hiking boots and a medium-weight jacket was inadequate for the severe conditions. Though conscious, she showed signs of advanced cold exposure, slurred speech, sluggish movements, and visible shivering that had probably progressed from violent to weakening as her core temperature dropped. "I'm Jack," he said, already unzipping his pack to extract an emergency blanket. "What's your name? Where's your car?" "Kira," she replied, as he wrapped the reflective material around her shoulders. "Kira Tsosi. Car slid. Off-road. Quarter-mile that way." She gestured vaguely eastward. "Nathan stayed. Fixed the tire. Told me to find help." Jack offered her a sip of hot broth from his thermos, which she accepted with trembling hands. The immediate priority was warming her enough to prevent further decline while determining how to help her brother, who might be in even worse condition if he'd remained exposed for the same period. "How long ago did you leave the car?" Jack asked, trying to gauge the timeline. "Don't know, and was light, then dark came. Several hours then. Dangerously long in these temperatures, especially if her brother had remained stationary by the disabled vehicle." "Kira, I need to find your brother," Jack explained, helping her to her feet once the broth had provided some immediate energy. "Can you walk with my help, or should I come back for you?" Despite her weakened state, determination flashed in her dark eyes. "I can walk," she insisted. "Nathan needs help now." Jack adjusted their course based on Kira's directions, supporting much of her weight as they moved toward the location of the stranded vehicle. Rusty took point, seeming to understand the urgency of their mission without specific commands. The stone pendant pressed against Jack's chest beneath his layers of clothing, its warmth somehow intensified despite the frigid air around them. As they struggled through the snow, Jack found himself wondering about the strange confluence of events: Joseph's appearance and disappearance, the mysterious totem, and now stranded travelers needing assistance precisely when he had been given. Cryptic warnings about watching and listening. What is buried will surface. The phrase from Joseph's note echoed in Jack's mind as they crested a small rise and spotted the dark outline of a vehicle below, nearly invisible against the surrounding night, except for the intermittent flash of hazard lights blinking weakly through accumulated snow. The significance of these connections would have to wait. Right now, someone's life hung in the balance, dependent on his ability to find and render aid in the frozen darkness of a desert, transformed into something unrecognizable by the whims of nature and perhaps forces Jack had yet to understand. The vehicle was a mid-sized SUV, its dark blue exterior now largely obscured by accumulated snow. One wheel had slipped off the eroded shoulder of the access road, tilting the entire frame at an awkward angle that explained why they couldn't simply drive out of their predicament. The hazard lights blinked with decreasing intensity, suggesting the battery was failing after hours of use. As they approached, Jack saw no movement inside or around the vehicle. "Nathan!" Kira called, her voice stronger after the broth, but still weakened by exposure. "Nathan! We brought help!" No response came from the darkened SUV. Jack reached the driver's side door, brushing snow from the window to peer inside. Empty. He circled to the passenger side, finding it similarly vacant. The back cargo area contained camping equipment and supplies, evidence of a planned excursion rather than casual travel, but no sign of Kira's brother. "He was trying to change the tire," Kira explained, leaning heavily against the vehicle's frame. "Said he'd stay with the car while I found help." Rusty had already begun quartering the area, nose to the ground, picking up a scent trail that led away from the road toward a cluster of large boulders, about 30 yards distant. The dog's behavior shifted from investigative to urgent, looking back at Jack with clear communication that he'd found something significant. "This way," Jack urged, supporting Kira as they followed Rusty's lead. The flashlight beam caught reflective material first, a silver emergency blanket similar to the one Jack had wrapped around Kira, though this one lay partially unfurled on the ground rather than secured around a person. Beyond it, propped awkwardly against the largest boulder, sat a young man whose resemblance to Kira confirmed his identity before introductions could be made. Nathan Sosi was perhaps 2 or 3 years older than his sister, his features sharpened by pain rather than cold exposure. Unlike Kira, he had managed to dress more appropriately for the conditions, wearing a heavy down jacket and insulated pants. His right leg extended at an unnatural angle, the lower section visibly misaligned even through his clothing. "Compound. Fracture," Jack assessed immediately, kneeling beside the injured man. "What happened?" Nathan's eyes flickered open, awareness returning as he registered their presence. "Slipped on the ice while changing the tire," he explained through gritted teeth. "Heard it snap when I went down. Tried to signal Kira, but she'd already gone. For help." He glanced at his sister with relief, evident despite his pain. "Thank God you found her." Jack conducted a quick field assessment, determining that beyond the obvious leg fracture, Nathan was also developing hypothermia, though less advanced than his sister's condition thanks to his better clothing. The situation remained critical. They were still a considerable distance from Jack's cabin. The temperature continued to drop, and Nathan couldn't walk on his injured leg. "We need to stabilize that fracture, then get you both to shelter," Jack explained, already unpacking the limited first aid supplies he'd brought. "My place is about 1.5 miles from here. I can fashion a travois to transport you, but it won't be comfortable. Beats freezing to death," Nathan replied with strained humor, while Jack improvised a splint using trekking poles from the siblings' camping gear. He learned more about their circumstances. Kira and Nathan were headed to document petroglyphs in a remote canyon for Nathan's graduate research in indigenous studies at Northern Arizona University. Their GPS had directed them along the access road as a supposed shortcut, not accounting for the rapidly deteriorating conditions after the unexpected snowstorm. "No one even knows we're in this area," Kira admitted, now lucid enough to grasp the seriousness of their situation. "Our check-in with the university field office isn't scheduled until tomorrow evening." This information only reinforced the urgency of reaching adequate shelter. Using materials from his pack and items salvaged from their vehicle, Jack constructed a rudimentary but functional travois, a frame of straight branches lashed together with cord, covered with an unzipped sleeping bag to create a drag sled that could be pulled across the snow. Transferring Nathan onto this improvised transport proved painful despite their care. Once settled, Jack secured him with straps from the siblings' backpacks, ensuring he wouldn't slide off during transport. The return journey would be arduous. Jack would need to pull substantial weight across difficult terrain while also supporting Kira, whose condition had improved slightly but remained precarious. "We'll take regular breaks," Jack explained, as he positioned himself at the front of the travois, slipping the pulling harness he'd fashioned over his shoulders. "Kira, stay close to me. If you feel yourself getting too tired or confused, tell me immediately." She nodded, determination evident despite her exhaustion. Nathan lay silent on the travois, face taut with pain, but offering no complaints as they began the slow journey back toward Jack's cabin. Rusty took up a protective position, alternating between leading the way and circling back to check on their progress. The dog's intuitive understanding of their needs struck Jack as unusually perceptive. Even for an animal he'd come to respect for its intelligence. The stone pendant against Jack's chest maintained its improbable warmth, seeming to pulse subtly with each labored step. He found himself drawing strength from its presence, though the rational part of his mind insisted this was merely psychological, a placebo effect born of suggestion and the strange circumstances surrounding Joseph's visit. Their progress was painfully slow. What had taken Jack 40 minutes to cover on the outbound journey now stretched into hours as they navigated the challenging terrain. Nathan bore the jarring movement stoically, occasionally losing consciousness only to awaken with muffled gasps. When the travois bumped over particularly rough ground, Kira walked alongside Jack, initially insisting she needed no support, but gradually accepting his steadying hand as fatigue and cold sapped her remaining strength. During one of their brief rest periods, she studied Jack with open curiosity. "You live out here alone?" she asked, her breath clouding in the freezing air. "By choice," Jack confirmed, adjusting the travois harness that had begun to dig painfully into his shoulders. "Been about 4 months now. Most people don't choose this kind of isolation," she observed, "especially not someone who looks like they came from—" She hesitated. "A city?" Jack supplied. "I was an architect in Phoenix until last year. Life took some unexpected turns." Kira nodded as if this explained something meaningful to her. "Our grandmother would say, the land calls to those who need its teaching." The comment triggered Jack's memory of Joseph's similar observations about his presence in the desert. Before he could pursue this connection, Rusty's sudden alertness interrupted their conversation. The dog stood rigid, facing back the way they had come, a low growl building in his throat. Jack extinguished his flashlight immediately, instinct telling him to eliminate the beacon that marked their position in the otherwise pitch-black landscape. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, straining to hear whatever had triggered the dog's reaction. For several long moments, only the sound of their breathing disturbed the night silence. Then, faintly at first but growing stronger, came the distinctive crunch of footsteps. On crusted snow, someone approaching from the direction of the stranded vehicle. "Hello?" Jack called cautiously, one hand dropping instinctively to the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. "Who's there?" No response came, but the footsteps continued, drawing steadily closer, though still beyond the range of natural vision in the moonless night. Jack positioned himself between the approaching sounds and the siblings, uncertainty mounting as the footfalls grew louder without verbal acknowledgement. A sudden gust of wind brought the scent of sage and wood smoke, an improbable combination given their surroundings and the absence of any campfire for miles. Rusty's growls subsided, replaced by the alert but non-aggressive posture he had adopted when Joseph first appeared at Jack's cabin. "Who's there?" Jack repeated, tension evident in his voice. "One who follows tracks in darkness," came the response. The familiar measured cadence immediately recognizable despite the unexpected context. Joseph Begay emerged from the shadows, his figure materializing from the darkness with such abruptness that Jack momentarily questioned his own perception. The Navajo elder appeared exactly as he had the previous day, showing no signs of exposure, despite the freezing temperatures and challenging conditions. He carried his walking stick adorned with feathers and symbols, though now it glowed faintly with what appeared to be foxfire, a biological luminescence that normally occurred only on rotting wood in much damper environments than the desert. "Joseph?" Jack managed, disbelief competing with relief in his voice. "How did you—" "Questions for safer places," Joseph interrupted, his gaze already assessing the injured man on the travois and Kira's weakened condition. "Night deepens, cold strengthens, death walks close to these two." Without waiting for response, he moved to Nathan's side, kneeling to place a hand on the young man's forehead with the natural authority of someone accustomed to tending the injured. He spoke briefly in Navajo, words Jack couldn't understand but which seemed to ease some of Nathan's tension. "You know them?" Jack asked, struggling to make sense of this new development. "Know of them," Joseph replied cryptically, rising to face. "The path shows what is needed." He glanced at the pendant visible now at Jack's throat, nodding once, as if confirming something to himself. "You wear the stone. Good. It helps us now." Before Jack could question this statement, Joseph moved to the front of the travois, positioning himself opposite Jack at the pulling harness. "Together," he said simply, "strength doubles when purpose aligns." Despite his apparent age, Joseph demonstrated remarkable vigor as they resumed their journey, sharing the burden of pulling Nathan's improvised transport while occasionally supporting Kira with his free hand. Jack found himself adjusting to the elders' natural rhythm, their movements synchronizing to minimize jostling for the injured man. As they walked, Joseph began a low, melodic chanting, not loud enough to echo across the landscape, but creating an audible cocoon around their small party. Though the words were unfamiliar to Jack, their effect was tangible. His fatigue seemed to recede, replaced by a steady energy that sustained each step, without the bone-deep exhaustion he'd begun to feel before Joseph's arrival. Kira responded similarly, her posture straightening as she matched their pace with renewed determination. Even Nathan seemed affected, his pain-drawn features relaxing incrementally as the chanting continued. Jack found himself wondering if the sensations were merely psychological, the power of suggestion combined with the relief of additional help, or something more difficult to categorize within his usual understanding of cause and effect. The stone pendant seemed to vibrate subtly against his skin, in harmony with Joseph's chanting, its warmth intensifying until it felt like a small ember nestled against his chest. When they finally crested the last rise, revealing Jack's cabin in the near distance, the sight of yellow light spilling from its windows created a moment of confusion. Jack was certain he'd extinguished all lamps before departing, conscious of fire risk in his absence. "Someone's in my cabin," he said, halting their progress. Joseph showed no concern at this observation. "Yes," he confirmed, "one who helps prepare." Before Jack could demand clarification, Joseph resumed walking, compelling the others to continue or be left behind. As they approached the cabin, the front door opened, framing a silhouette against the warm interior light. A woman stepped onto the porch, elderly, dressed in traditional Navajo clothing, her silver hair bound in a bun, secured with what appeared to be turquoise pins. "Grandmother?" Kira's voice broke with astonishment. The woman, apparently the siblings, grandmother, showed no surprise at their arrival, merely nodding in acknowledgement before speaking rapidly to Joseph in Navajo. Whatever information they exchanged seemed to satisfy both elders, who then turned their attention to the practical matters at hand. "Bring the injured one inside," the grandmother directed Jack in perfect, unaccented English. "I have prepared the bed." The next hour passed in a blur of purposeful activity. Jack and Joseph carried Nathan inside on an improvised stretcher, settling him on Jack's bed as directed. The grandmother, who introduced herself simply as Margaret Sosie, took immediate charge of both her grandchildren's care, producing from an old leather bag various herbal preparations and poultices that she applied with practiced efficiency. The cabin had been transformed in Jack's absence. A fire blazed in the wood stove with a different quality than his usual fires, steadier, producing more heat with less smoke. Fragrant herbs hung in small bundles from the ceiling beams, filling the air with scents that somehow managed to be both medicinal and soothing. Most remarkably, additional supplies had appeared, extra blankets, containers of what looked like homemade remedies, even fresh bread cooling on his small counter. "How did you know to come here?" Jack finally asked Margaret as she finished bandaging her grandson's splintered leg, using supplies from Jack's first aid kit, supplemented by her own materials. The elderly woman exchanged a glance with Joseph before responding. "The hawk messenger found me," she said, as if this explained everything. "Joseph sent word that my grandchildren walked a dangerous path. I came to meet them here where paths cross." Jack looked to Joseph for clarification, but the Navajo elder had busied himself preparing tea from ingredients he'd apparently brought with him, or that had materialized in Jack's kitchen through means as mysterious as the Totem's appearance. "But how did you even get here?" Jack persisted, addressing Margaret. "The roads are impassable. I just received word from the county that they won't be cleared for days." Margaret's weathered face creased in a smile that combined amusement with something more enigmatic. "Not all paths require roads, Mr. Harrison. Some exist only for those who know how to walk them." From his position on the bed, Nathan spoke up, his voice stronger after his grandmother's treatments. "Our grandmother is known among our people for appearing where she's needed, often before anyone realizes they need her. The reservation clinic keeps trying to hire her as a healer, but she prefers the old ways." Kira, now wrapped in blankets, near the stove and sipping a tea Joseph had prepared, nodded in agreement. "When we were children, we called her the one who walks between worlds. Our father said it runs in her family line." Margaret made a dismissive gesture at these explanations. "Old stories. What matters is that we are all here now, where we need to be." She fixed Jack with a penetrating gaze. "The storm was no accident, Mr. Harrison. Nor was my grandchildren's presence on that road, nor Joseph finding your fire yesterday." Jack struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't sound dismissive, of beliefs clearly important to everyone else in the room. Before he could speak, Joseph approached, offering him a ceramic cup containing a steaming liquid unlike any tea Jack recognized, darker, with an iridescent quality that caught the firelight in unusual ways. "Drink," Joseph instructed. "Then we talk about why the hawk totem stands at your door and what it asks of you." Jack accepted the cup automatically, the stone pendant suddenly heavy against his chest, despite its modest physical weight. The events of the past 24 hours had accumulated beyond coincidence, beyond rational explanation. The mysterious appearance and disappearance of Joseph, the inexplicable totem, the warmth of the stone pendant, the timely arrival of both Joseph and Margaret Sosi exactly when needed, all suggested patterns operating beyond his previous understanding of possibility. As Jack raised the cup to his lips, he caught Joseph watching him with an intensity that communicated clearly. Whatever he had believed about the world and its workings was about to be fundamentally challenged. The liquid tasted of earth and sky simultaneously, bitter yet somehow refreshing, carrying complex notes that reminded him of desert rain on hot stones and sage burning in clean flames. "The medicine stone you wear tells me you're ready to hear." "The truth," Joseph said as Jack finished the tea. "Ready to see beyond surfaces to what lies beneath." "What truth?" Jack asked, aware that he stood at some form of threshold, though its nature remained unclear. "The truth of why the desert called you here," Margaret interjected, her voice carrying the authority of decades of accumulated wisdom. "Why did your life in the city of the Phoenix burn away? Why these young ones needed to find you tonight. And you them. Joseph nodded agreement. The hawk totem awakened at your door stands as witness and guardian to what begins now. Jack looked between the two elders, then to Kira and Nathan, who watched this exchange, with expressions suggesting they understood far more about what was unfolding than he did. Even Rusty had adopted an attitude of attentive waiting, his usual. Restlessness replaced by focused stillness at Joseph's feet. What begins now? Jack finally asked, unable to suppress the question, despite a lingering skepticism that fought against the evidence of his experiences. Joseph's reply carried the weight of pronouncement rather than mere explanation. Your healing, their protection, and the restoration of something lost between our worlds long ago, the crossing of paths that was written before any of us walked upon this earth. Margaret approached Jack, her small, weathered hand reaching out to touch the stone pendant with familiar reverence. This stone has waited 5 generations to find you, she said softly. My grandmother's grandmother gave it to a man much like you, lost between worlds, seeking purpose after great loss. Now it returns when similar healing is needed. The pendant seemed to pulse once against Jack's skin, as if confirming her words. The rational architect who had arrived in the desert 4 months earlier would have dismissed all of this as elaborate cultural metaphor at best, or superstitious nonsense at worst. But the man who stood in this transformed cabin, having witnessed inexplicable events and felt the uncanny guidance of forces he couldn't name, found himself unable to maintain that comfortable skepticism. I don't understand what you want from me, he admitted, the humility of the statement surprising even himself. Joseph and Margaret exchanged a look that contained volumes of unspoken communication. It was Joseph who finally answered, his voice carrying both compassion and unmistakable challenge. Understanding comes through doing, not thinking, he said. The hawk totem at your door asks something simple but difficult, that you open yourself to healing beyond what reason alone can provide, that you accept guidance from traditions your people have forgotten or dismissed, that you serve as bridge between worlds that have grown too distant from each other. Jack might have questioned this cryptic response further, but at that moment, Rusty suddenly rose to alertness, moving to the door with focused intention rather than alarm. Seconds later, a knock sounded. 3 decisive raps that seemed to echo. With significance beyond their acoustic properties, everyone in the cabin froze, gazes converging on the door, as if it represented more than merely a physical barrier between inside and outside. Jack moved to answer it, strangely unsurprised when Joseph placed a restraining hand on his arm. The 3rd visitor arrives, the elder said quietly. The circle begins to close. With those words hanging in the air, Jack reached for the door handle, aware that whatever, or whoever, waited on the other side would complete some pattern whose full dimensions he had yet to comprehend. The pendant burned against his skin with increasing intensity as his fingers closed around the cold metal of the latch, preparing to open more than just a physical entrance to his isolated cabin. The door swung open, releasing a swirl of cabin, warmth into the frigid night air. Against all logic, no snowdrifts had accumulated on the porch. Instead, a clear path led directly to the steps, as if meticulously maintained during Jack's absence. Standing before him was a man who epitomized the collision of worlds that seemed to be the evening's theme. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore modern cold-weather gear, a technical parka over insulated pants with sturdy mountaineering boots. Yet his long black hair was braided in a traditional style, and his sharp-featured face bore markings Jack recognized as ceremonial paint rather than simple decoration. "Daniel!" Margaret greeted the newcomer from inside the cabin, her tone suggesting she'd been expecting him specifically. The man, Daniel, inclined his head respectfully toward the elderly woman before turning his attention back to Jack. "Daniel, Blackhorn," he introduced himself, extending a gloved hand. "Park Ranger, Cultural Liaison for the Monument Valley Tribal Authority, and apparently the last piece of whatever puzzle is assembling itself in your home tonight." Jack shook his hand, noting the strength in the grip and the frank assessment in Daniel's dark eyes. "Jack Harrison," he replied, stepping aside to allow the newcomer entry, "though I'm beginning to think my name is the only thing I'm certain about anymore." A flash of understanding crossed Daniel's features, followed by a sympathetic half-smile. "Welcome to the club," he said quietly as he passed Jack to enter the cabin. Once inside, Daniel greeted Joseph with evident respect, clasping forearms in what appeared to be a traditional gesture between men of standing. His interaction with the Sosi siblings was more contemporary, a fist bump for Nathan despite his injured condition, and a brief one-armed hug for Kira. "Your grandmother called me 4 hours ago," Daniel explained to the siblings. "Said you were in trouble in an area I know well. I've been searching since, following—" He hesitated, glancing at Jack before continuing more cautiously, "tracking signs others might miss." Jack closed the door against the cold, turning to find everyone watching him with varying expressions of expectation. The pendant at his throat had settled into a steady, subtle warmth, no longer pulsing, but maintaining a temperature completely independent of the cabin's ambient heat. "I think," Jack said deliberately, "that I'm owed some explanations, starting with how Margaret called anyone when there's no cell service within 20 miles of here, continuing with how she and Joseph entered my locked cabin during my absence, and concluding with why everyone seems to think my doorstep totem is somehow significant beyond being an uninvited lawn ornament." The directness of his questions might have seemed confrontational, but the delivery carried more confusion than hostility. After hours of accumulating inexplicable circumstances, Jack's pragmatic nature demanded at least an attempt at coherent understanding. Joseph and Margaret exchanged one of their communicative glances before Margaret nodded, as if granting permission for a particular approach. "We'll answer what we can," Joseph said, gesturing toward the small dining table. "But first, Daniel has traveled far through dangerous conditions. Food and rest before deep talking." The practicality of this suggestion couldn't be denied. Jack joined the others at the table while Margaret, moving with the confident familiarity of someone in her own kitchen rather than a stranger in an unfamiliar cabin, served a stew that had materialized during Jack's absence. The rich aroma of slow-cooked meat and herbs filled the small space, reminding everyone of basic needs temporarily overshadowed by the evening's mysteries. As they ate, Daniel provided context for his presence, explaining that he served dual roles. Within the tribal park system, official liaison for government interactions and unofficial protector of sacred sites that remained unlisted on public maps. His history with the Tsosi family stretched back generations. His grandfather and Margaret's husband had been ceremony brothers, creating a bond that transcended blood relation. "When Margaret's call came, I didn't question it," Daniel concluded. "Her requests are rare enough that they always carry weight." "But how did she call you?" Jack persisted, returning to his earlier question. "There's no phone service here, and I never gave anyone this location when I moved in." Daniel looked to Margaret, clearly deferring to her judgment about how much to share. The elderly woman set down her spoon, studying Jack with penetrating intensity before responding. "Some communications don't require technology, Mr. Harrison," she said finally. "Just as some journeys don't require roads, and some healing doesn't require medicine that comes in bottles." Rather than clarifying, this response only deepened Jack's confusion. He turned to Joseph, hoping for a more concrete explanation, but the elder had focused on his meal with deliberate attention, clearly indicating the conversation would progress on Margaret's terms. "Look," Jack said, frustration edging into his voice. "I appreciate everyone's help tonight. You may well have saved Kira and Nathan's lives, but I can't just accept cryptic statements as explanations for things that shouldn't be possible. Like, a totem appearing outside your door overnight?" Daniel asked mildly. "Or an elderly Navajo woman preparing food in your locked cabin during your absence? Or perhaps the stone around your neck that's currently glowing despite being in shadow?" Jack's hand moved instinctively to the pendant, confirming Daniel's observation. A faint luminescence emanated from the stone, visible now that he'd drawn attention to it. The rational explanations Jack had been formulating dissolved in the face of this new impossibility. "The problem isn't that you can't accept these things, Mr. Harrison," Margaret said gently. "It's that you've spent a lifetime being taught not to see what's always been there. The veil between worlds has always been thinnest in places like this desert, where extremity of landscape creates extremity of perception." From his position on the bed, Nathan spoke up unexpectedly. "It's why I've been researching the petroglyphs in this region," he explained. "They're not just primitive art or record-keeping as Western academics assumed for decades. Many are maps, not of physical geography, but of points where different realities converge." Kira nodded agreement. "My brother's doctoral work focuses on interdimensional thresholds in indigenous cosmology," she added. "Most university professors think it's purely metaphorical. Our grandmother knows better." Jack looked between them, struggling to integrate these concepts with his architect's understanding of physical space and structure. "You're talking about, what, magic? Alternate realities?" "I'm talking about a more complex universe than the one you were taught to perceive," Margaret corrected, "where consciousness shapes reality as much as physical laws, and where intention creates pathways between possibilities." Before Jack could form a response, Daniel interjected with unexpected pragmatism. "Maybe we should start with something more concrete," he suggested. "Joseph, the totem you carved. It's a calling sign, yes? Perhaps explaining its purpose would help ground this conversation." Joseph set down his spoon, nodding agreement. "The hawk totem speaks to watchers on both sides of the veil," he said. "It marks this place as a meeting point between worlds and identifies the cabin's resident as a bridge walker, one who can move between realities when properly guided." "I've never walked between worlds in my life," Jack objected. "I'm an architect from Phoenix who burned out, went bankrupt, and retreated to the desert to lick his wounds. Nothing mystical about my story." "Are you certain?" Margaret asked with gentle skepticism. "Consider your childhood, Mr. Harrison. Were there never moments when you saw things others couldn't, when you knew things you shouldn't have been able to know, when you felt connections to places or times beyond your direct experience?" The questions triggered unexpected memories. His mother's concern when 6-year-old Jack had described in perfect detail a great-grandfather he'd never met, or seen photos of, the recurring dreams of ancient cities that had ultimately inspired his architectural career, his uncanny ability to enter historic buildings and intuitively understand their original layout, even when renovations had obscured the initial design. "Everyone has déjà vu or weird dreams," Jack said, though his conviction had noticeably weakened. "It doesn't make me a bridge walker or whatever you called it." "Perhaps not alone," Joseph agreed. "But combined with your bloodline, your life path, and the stone's recognition, these create a pattern even skeptics cannot dismiss." "My bloodline?" Jack's confusion deepened. "What does my family have to do with any of this?" The elders exchanged another of their meaningful glances before Margaret spoke. "Your great-grandmother on your father's side. Her name before marriage was Sarah Benally, yes?" Jack stared at her, genuinely shocked. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because Sarah Benally was my mother's cousin," Margaret replied simply. Which makes us relatives, Mr. Harrison, though distant by Western counting methods. In Navajo understanding, we are much closer, part of the same clan, sharing responsibilities to the land and its spirits. The revelation struck Jack with physical force, causing him to lean back in his chair as if distancing himself from its implications. His father had rarely spoken of his grandmother's heritage, mentioning only that there was some Native American blood in their lineage. Jack had never pursued the connection, viewing it as irrelevant to his contemporary life and career. "That's not possible," he said weakly, though he already sensed the truth in Margaret's claim. It explained too many coincidences. His inexplicable draw to this particular piece of desert land when seeking escape from Phoenix, the immediate sense of homecoming he'd experienced despite the harsh conditions, even his unusually quick adaptation to survival skills that should have taken years to develop. "The stone recognized you because it once belonged to our shared ancestors," Margaret continued, undeterred by his disbelief. "5 generations ago, it passed from our family to a man who needed its protection during a time of great transition between our peoples. Now it returns through you, completing a circle that began before any of us were born." Daniel leaned forward, his expression suggesting he understood Jack's overwhelmed state. "Look," he said, "I was in your position once, born and raised in mainstream America, college-educated, skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or photographed. It took a near-death experience in these canyons to open my perception to what the elders had been trying to teach me my whole life." "Which is what exactly?" Jack asked, grateful for the slightly more relatable perspective. "That reality is participatory, not objective," Daniel replied. "That consciousness shapes experience in ways Western science is only beginning to acknowledge. That the boundaries between past, present, future, between material and spiritual, are constructs that serve practical purposes but don't reflect the true nature of existence." From anyone else, such statements would have sounded like New Age platitudes. Coming from this clearly grounded, practical man who balanced professional responsibilities in the modern world with evident respect for traditional knowledge, they carried unexpected weight. Joseph stood suddenly, moving to the cabin's single window to gaze out into the darkness. "The explaining time ends," he announced. "Now comes showing time." Before anyone could question this pronouncement, Joseph opened the window, allowing a blast of freezing air to enter the cabin along with something else, a swirl of luminous particles that moved with deliberate purpose rather than following the air current. The glowing motes coalesced into a roughly bird-shaped formation that hovered in the center of the room, pulsing with golden light. Rusty, who had remained calmly observant throughout the evening's discussions, rose to attention but showed no fear at the manifestation. If anything, the dog's posture suggested recognition rather than alarm. "The messenger confirms what words cannot convince," Joseph said, as the luminous form rotated slowly above the table. "The veil thins further. The danger grows closer." "Danger?" Jack managed, unable to take his eyes off the impossible phenomenon floating in his cabin. "What danger?" "The same that threatens my grandchildren," Margaret answered grimly. "The same that has targeted bridgewalkers and their protectors for generations. Those who profit from keeping the world separated and weakened rather than connected and whole." The light form pulsed more rapidly, as if responding to her words, then dispersed into individual particles that spiraled toward the pendant at Jack's throat. As they made contact, the stone absorbed them, its glow intensifying until Jack had to resist the urge to remove it from his skin. "They sense the awakening," Joseph observed, closing the window against the cold. "They will come soon, seeking to end what begins here." "Who are they?" Jack demanded, his architect's need for clarity asserting itself despite the increasingly surreal situation. Daniel's expression darkened. We have different names for them. The Diné call them skinwalkers or shapeshifters. Other tribes have their own terms. Modern language might call them interdimensional parasites, entities that feed on fear, chaos, and spiritual disconnection. For centuries they've worked through human agents, Margaret added. People willing to sacrifice connection with the land and its spirits in exchange for personal power or wealth. These agents may not even understand what they truly serve. In my position with the Park Service, Daniel continued, I've tracked increasing incidents of sacred site desecration, not random vandalism, but systematic attempts to disrupt energy points where the barriers between worlds are naturally thinner. Nathan and Kira's research expedition was targeted because they're mapping these sites, documenting what should remain hidden according to those who profit from separation. Jack looked to the siblings for confirmation. Nathan nodded grimly from his position on the bed. Someone sabotaged our vehicle before we left Flagstaff, he explained. The mechanic who checked it afterward said our brake lines had been partially cut, enough to eventually fail, but not immediately, making it look like mechanical failure rather than deliberate damage. We thought it was just bad luck when we slid off the road, Kira added. But now you understand it was intentional, Margaret finished. Just as your GPS sending you along this particular route was no coincidence. You were being directed away from help and toward isolation. Jack struggled to process these claims, which seemed to escalate from mysterious spiritual experiences to outright conspiracy theories. Yet the evidence before him, from the luminous manifestation to the improbable convergence of individuals in his remote cabin, demanded consideration beyond his usual parameters of acceptance. Even if I believe all this, he said slowly, what does it have to do with me, with the totem or the pendant? You occupy a nexus point, Joseph explained, returning to the table. This land, the very spot where your cabin stands, has been a crossing place between worlds for thousands of years. Those who seek to maintain separation cannot allow bridgewalkers to establish themselves at such locations, which is why they'll come for you, Daniel said bluntly, just as they've tried to eliminate others who could strengthen the connections between realities. The pendant grew suddenly hot against Jack's skin, not burning, but intensifying beyond comfortable warmth. Simultaneously, Rusty moved to the door with focused alertness, a low growl building in his throat. They're already here, Margaret announced, rising with surprising agility for her age, sooner than expected. Daniel immediately moved to the window, peering out into the darkness before turning back with grim confirmation. Headlights on the access road. At least 2 vehicles, moving fast for these conditions. That's impossible, Jack objected, joining him at the window. The road is impassable. Martin texted me himself, saying it wouldn't be cleared for days. These aren't ordinary travelers, Joseph said, already gathering his walking stick and what appeared to be small medicine bundles from his pack. They don't follow normal limits. The cabin's atmosphere transformed instantly from philosophical discussion to urgent preparation. Margaret moved to her grandchildren, speaking rapid instructions in Navajo while pressing small objects into their hands. Daniel retrieved a modern backpack from near the door, withdrawing what looked like technological equipment alongside more traditional protective items. We have perhaps 15 minutes, he estimated, checking something on a handheld device. They'll approach cautiously, but once they confirm the pattern of energies here, they'll move quickly. Jack stood momentarily frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from theoretical danger to apparent imminent threat. This is crazy, he muttered. We should call for help. The sheriff, state police. Against what? Daniel asked pointedly. What would you report? That spiritual entities and their human allies are targeting your cabin because of its metaphysical significance? How far would that call get? The practical impossibility of conventional assistance struck Jack forcefully. Regardless of whether He fully believed the explanations he'd been given. The approaching vehicles represented a clear threat to everyone in the cabin, including the injured Nathan, who couldn't be quickly evacuated. "What do we do?" he asked finally. Decision made to act now and process later. Joseph approached, placing a weathered hand on Jack's shoulder. "We awaken what sleeps in you," he said simply. "The bridge-walker who can turn their weapons against them." "I don't know how to do that," Jack admitted. "The stone knows," Margaret assured him, joining them, "and we will guide you. But first, we must prepare the boundaries." What followed was a coordinated series of actions that blended indigenous ceremonial practice with surprisingly technical preparations. Daniel established what he called a disruption field, using small devices placed at cardinal points around the cabin's perimeter. Technology, he explained, was developed by engineers within the tribe who understood the science behind traditional protections. Joseph and Margaret worked in tandem, creating a more esoteric boundary using cornmeal, cedar, sage, and other elements Jack couldn't identify. Their movements followed patterns that seemed both choreographed and intuitive, accompanied by songs so quietly voiced they were barely audible, yet filled the space with palpable energy. Meanwhile, Kira helped position her injured brother more defensively, away from windows and doors, while assembling makeshift barriers from furniture that might provide additional protection. Jack found himself directed to the center of these preparations, standing before the wood stove with the pendant, now fully exposed outside his clothing. Its glow had intensified to illuminate his immediate surroundings, casting strange shadows that moved subtly even when their sources remained still. "The hawk totem calls to its counterpart within you," Joseph explained, standing before Jack with his walking stick planted firmly between them. "The bridge-walker exists in the space between your everyday self and the ancestor self that remembers the old ways." "I don't understand what that means," Jack confessed, frustration mixing with the adrenaline of approaching a threat. "Understanding. It comes after experience," Margaret said from where she completed the final elements of their protective boundary. "Trust the stone. Let it guide you." "They're coming up the final approach," Daniel announced from his position at the window. 2 SUVs, heavy-duty models. I count at least 6 figures inside, maybe more. Joseph fixed Jack with an intense gaze. "When I was a young man, my grandfather told me that each person holds many possible selves within them, versions that emerge or remain dormant depending on life's path. The self that designed buildings in Phoenix is only one version of Jack. Harrison, tonight we need the self that remembers how to walk between worlds." The headlights appeared through the window now, illuminating the cabin's interior with harsh, artificial brightness that contrasted sharply with the organic glow of the pendant. Engines cut off simultaneously, followed by the distinctive sounds of multiple car doors opening and closing. "Listen," Joseph instructed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Not with ears, but with the place behind thoughts. The stone will show you how." Jack closed his eyes, more from overwhelming sensory input than belief in the instruction. The pendant's warmth spread upward from his chest, creating an unusual sensation that extended to his throat and then his head. Not uncomfortable, but distinctly foreign, as if parts of him long dormant were being systematically awakened. Behind his closed eyelids, patterns began to form, geometries that resembled architectural blueprints, but organized according to principles he'd never encountered. As these patterns proliferated and connected, Jack experienced a sudden, vertiginous shift in perception, as if viewing his surroundings from multiple perspectives simultaneously. When he opened his eyes, the cabin appeared fundamentally changed. Objects retained their physical forms, but now displayed visible energy patterns flowing through and around them. More shockingly, The boundaries Joseph and Margaret had established manifested as a luminous lattice enveloping the structure. A complex, multidimensional shield anchored to the earth beneath them. "I can see it," he whispered, astonished. "All of it." Joseph nodded, unsurprised. "The Bridgewalker awakens," he confirmed. "Now, prepare yourself." Those who approach carry darkness that feeds on doubt and fear. Remember who you are, all versions of who you are. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside, approaching with deliberate, measured pace. The pendant's glow intensified further as Jack turned toward the door, feeling strangely calm despite the tension pervading the cabin. "They're here," Daniel announced, unnecessarily as a heavy knock sounded. 3 slow, deliberate impacts that seemed to test the structure's integrity rather than request entry. Jack moved toward the door with newfound purpose, the pendant guiding him through its pulsing warmth. Whatever or whoever waited on the other side, he suddenly understood that this confrontation had been building since the moment he chose this isolated piece of desert for his retreat. "Remember," Margaret called softly as his hand reached, "for the latch, they cannot take what you do not surrender." With those words echoing in his mind, Jack opened the door to face whatever had pursued them across dimensions and through snowbound desert to reach this remote threshold between worlds. 3 figures stood on Jack's porch, arranged in a triangle formation that somehow appeared more strategic than coincidental. Their appearance initially registered as ordinary: 2 men and a woman dressed in expensive winter gear appropriate for the conditions. Yet through Jack's newly awakened perception, he detected disturbing inconsistencies in their forms, as if their human shapes were merely convenient vessels, inadequately containing something fundamentally different. The woman at the forefront smiled with mechanical precision. "Mr. Harrison," she greeted him, her voice carrying an odd harmonic quality, like multiple tones layered together. "I apologize for the late intrusion. I'm Dr. Eleanor Vance from Southwestern Archaeological Preservation. We've been searching for 2 of our researchers who failed to check in, Nathan and Kira Tsosi." The falsehood was expertly crafted, containing enough truth to seem plausible while concealing darker purpose. Jack sensed rather than saw Joseph and Margaret move to positions slightly behind him, creating a protective formation of their own. "May I ask how you found this place?" Jack countered, making no move to admit the visitors. "The road's been impassable since the storm hit." Dr. Vance's smile remained fixed, though something shifted behind her eyes, a momentary suggestion of vertical pupils that vanished so quickly Jack might have imagined it, if not for his enhanced awareness. "We have specialized vehicles," she replied smoothly, "and excellent tracking capabilities. Now, if the Tsosis are here, we should evacuate them immediately. We have medical personnel standing by." Daniel had positioned himself near Nathan's bed, one hand resting casually on what Jack now recognized as a ceremonial blade disguised as a conventional hunting knife. Kira stood beside her brother, her posture suggesting she was prepared to defend him despite her own weakened condition. "Strange," Jack observed, keeping his tone conversational. "I spoke with the university field office earlier. They weren't expecting a check-in until tomorrow evening." The claim was entirely fabricated, but it produced an immediate reaction. The 2 men flanking Dr. Vance tensed perceptibly, energy patterns around them fluctuating in what Jack's enhanced perception registered as alarm. "There must be some confusion," Dr. Vance countered, her smile thinning. "Perhaps in the excitement of finding your guests, you misunderstood. May we come in? It's rather cold out here." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Jack replied, feeling the pendant pulse against his chest in time with his heartbeat. "The cabin's quite full, and one of my guests is injured. Perhaps you could leave your contact information, and we can arrange to meet you in town once the road's clear." The pretense of civility was evaporating rapidly. Dr. Vance's companions moved slightly forward, their movements too synchronized to be natural. Behind them, Jack noticed additional figures emerging from the vehicles, 4 more individuals advancing. Toward the cabin with purposeful strides. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Harrison," Dr. Vance said, all pretense of warmth vanishing from her voice. "That Socies possess sensitive research materials that belong to our organization. We are authorized to retrieve them by any means necessary." Jack felt Joseph's hand on his shoulder, a subtle pressure communicating support and caution simultaneously. The protective boundary they'd established around the cabin pulsed with increased luminosity in Jack's enhanced vision, responding to the escalating threat outside. "I think I understand the situation perfectly," Jack replied, a strange calm settling over him despite the danger. "You're not from any archaeological preservation society. The Socies aren't your researchers. And whatever you are, you're not entirely human." Dr. Vance's expression shifted, the carefully maintained human features briefly revealing something else beneath, angles and proportions that violated natural anatomical constraints. When she spoke again, the harmonic distortion in her voice had intensified. "Half-blood Bridgewalker," she hissed, the pretense abandoned entirely. "You see more than you should, but understand far less than you need. Stand aside. This need not involve you." "I'm already involved," Jack stated, feeling the pendant grow warmer against his skin. "You made sure of that when you marked my property for attention." The accusation was intuitive rather than informed, but Dr. Vance's reaction confirmed its accuracy. Her companions moved forward aggressively, hands extending in gestures Jack instinctively recognized as threatening, despite their seemingly innocuous form. "The boundary holds," Joseph murmured from behind Jack. "They cannot cross uninvited." Dr. Vance heard this exchange, her unnatural smile returning with predatory quality. "Ancient protections grow weak in modern times, Elder," she called past Jack. "Just as your numbers dwindle and your young forget the old ways." She raised one hand, making a sharp, dismissive gesture. The 4 figures from the vehicles had now arranged themselves at equidistant points around the cabin, each removing small objects from their pockets that glinted metallically in the headlights' illumination. "Last opportunity, Mr. Harrison," Dr. Vance announced. "Surrender the Socies and their research, and we'll leave you to your retirement." "That's not going to happen," Jack replied, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. Dr. Vance sighed with theatrical disappointment. Unfortunate, but not unexpected. She stepped back, addressing her companions without looking at them. "Proceed with containment protocol." The 4 individuals at the perimeter activated whatever devices they'd positioned, creating an immediate effect visible only through Jack's enhanced perception. A countering lattice of energy beginning to form around the protective boundary. Joseph and Margaret had established, seeking points of vulnerability to exploit. Jack instinctively moved to close the door, but Joseph's hand on his arm restrained him. "No," the elder said quietly. "Sealing them out also seals us in. The boundary must remain open for what comes next." Before Jack could question this strategy, Margaret joined them at the doorway, her small frame radiating surprising power as she addressed the intruders directly. "You violate ancient covenants," she stated, her voice carrying authority that belied her physical stature. "These lands are protected by agreements older than your corruption." Dr. Vance laughed, the sound fracturing into discordant components that hurt Jack's ears. "Agreements made when your people had strength to enforce them," she countered. "That time has passed, old woman. The barriers between worlds weaken further with each generation that forgets the old ways." "Not forgotten," Daniel called from inside the cabin, "just transformed." He activated something on one of his devices, creating an immediate disruption in the containment field the intruders were establishing. The countering lattice wavered, its energy patterns destabilizing momentarily before the operators adjusted their equipment to compensate. Dr. Vance's expression hardened. "Technological shamanism," she observed with contempt. "Pathetic hybrid. Practices for those who've lost pure connection," says the entity wearing a human form like an ill-fitting suit, Margaret retorted. "At least our adaptations honor both ancestry and evolution." The verbal exchange clearly functioned as more than mere argument. Each statement carried energetic weight that affected the opposing boundary systems. Jack sensed the strategic nature of this dialogue, buying time while both sides sought advantage. In what he now understood was a multidimensional confrontation, disguised as a physical standoff. Joseph leaned closer to Jack, speaking so quietly that only he could hear. "The pendant connects to the totem outside. When I give the signal, focus your awareness on that connection. See it as a completed circuit." Jack nodded almost imperceptibly, feeling the pendant's warmth increase, as if responding to the instruction. The stone's glow had intensified to the point where it now illuminated the doorway, casting strange shadows that moved independently of their sources. Dr. Vance noticed this development, her artificial composure slipping further. "The stone awakens." "Him too quickly," she snapped to her companions. "Accelerate the containment." The four operators adjusted their devices, creating an immediate intensification in the opposing energy field. Jack felt the protective boundary around the cabin shudder under the assault, weakening at critical juncture points. Inside the cabin, Kira suddenly cried out in pain, clutching her head as if experiencing intense pressure. Nathan's condition likewise deteriorated, his breathing becoming labored as the attacking field affected them physically. "Now," Joseph whispered urgently to Jack, "see the connection, complete the circuit." Jack focused his awareness on the pendant, visualizing its relationship to the hawk totem standing sentinel beside his door. In his enhanced perception, a thread of golden energy already connected the two objects, pulsing with potential rather than actualized power. Understanding intuitively what was required, Jack mentally completed the connection, imagining the circuit, closing between pendant, totem, and his own consciousness. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both objects flared with blinding luminosity, the energy between them expanding outward in a rippling wave that passed through the cabin's walls and collided with the attacker's containment field. Where the energies met, visible distortions occurred in what Jack perceived as the fabric of reality itself. Localized fluctuations that resembled heat mirages, but affected dimensional properties rather than merely visual perception. Dr. Vance staggered backward, her human disguise momentarily disrupting to reveal glimpses of something beneath that Jack's mind couldn't properly process. Anatomical impossibilities and geometries that violated natural law. Her companions experienced similar disruptions, their forms flickering between human appearance and something fundamentally other. "The bridge opens!" Margaret announced, her voice carrying triumph. "Joseph, the anchoring!" The Navajo elder produced a small leather pouch from within his clothing, casting its contents, a fine powder that glittered with unusual iridescence, in an arc that intersected the energy flowing between pendant and totem. Rather than falling to the ground, the powder suspended in mid-air, forming patterns that reminded Jack of the architectural geometries he'd perceived earlier behind his closed eyelids. "Daniel," Margaret called next, "the convergence point." The park ranger activated another of his devices, creating a focused beam of energy that intersected with both Joseph's suspended powder and the flow between pendant and totem. This triple conjunction produced a new phenomenon, a localized distortion in space that gradually stabilized into what appeared to be a window or portal approximately 4 feet in diameter, hovering just beyond the cabin's threshold. Through this opening, Jack glimpsed another landscape, similar to the snow-covered desert surrounding his cabin, but subtly altered, as if viewed through a different atmospheric lens. Colors appeared more vivid, landforms more sharply defined, and strange, luminous patterns connected features that seemed ordinary in his normal perception. "The ancestral realm manifests," Joseph explained urgently, "the place between places where they cannot follow without abandoning their corrupted forms." Dr. Vance had recovered her composure, though her human appearance remained unstable, flickering between convincing solidity and disturbing translucence. Her companions had retreated to the vehicles, apparently damaged by the energetic collision. "You think opening a temporary threshold will save you?" she snarled, her voice now completely inhuman, a modulating hiss that contained no pretense of normal speech. "Others will come. The separation must be maintained. Bridge-walkers must be eliminated." "Perhaps," Margaret acknowledged calmly. "But not tonight, and not here." She gestured to Jack, indicating he should step forward toward the portal. Part of him resisted, the rational architect who still struggled to accept the impossible events unfolding around him. Yet another aspect of his consciousness, newly awakened and increasingly dominant, recognized the threshold as something familiar, despite never having consciously encountered it before. "Trust yourself," Joseph urged quietly. "The blood remembers what the mind forgets." Jack stepped forward, extending one hand toward the portal. The pendant flared in response, its energy flowing down his arm to his fingertips, creating visible connections to the dimensional opening. As his hand made contact with the threshold, he experienced a sensation unlike anything in his previous experience, simultaneously hot and cold, solid and insubstantial, familiar and utterly alien. "The others now," Joseph directed. Quickly, while the way remained stable, Daniel helped Nathan to his feet, supporting the injured man as they moved toward the portal. Kira followed close behind, her earlier weakness seemingly diminished by proximity to the dimensional threshold. Margaret took up position beside Jack, her weathered hand joining his in maintaining contact with the portal. "You cannot escape what comes," Dr. Vance called, making no move to approach the energetic boundary that still separated them. The barriers between worlds weaken further with each turning of the cycle. Eventually, all thresholds will collapse, or perhaps transform into something neither side anticipates, Joseph countered, completing their formation around the portal. "The future remains unwritten, Skinwalker. Remember that when you report your failure to your masters." Dr. Vance's form flickered more violently, rage distorting her features into something barely recognizable as human. The operators had abandoned their equipment, retreating to the vehicles whose engines had started without visible drivers. Another impossibility in a night filled with them. "Through the threshold," Joseph instructed Jack. "Your connection anchors our passage. We follow in your wake." Jack hesitated only momentarily before stepping into the portal, the pendant's energy creating a protective cocoon around him as he transitioned between dimensions. The sensation defied conventional description, a momentary expansion of awareness that encompassed multiple realities simultaneously before resolving into a new equilibrium. He emerged into the landscape he'd glimpsed through the portal. Familiar, yet fundamentally altered. The desert stretched around him as before, covered in snow that somehow appeared more vital, each crystal distinct and luminous with its own minute energy signature. The air carried scents he recognized yet experienced with unprecedented richness: sage, pine, mineral dust, and something else that suggested vast age and elemental power. The others followed in quick succession, Nathan supported by Daniel, then Kira, Margaret, and finally Joseph, who gestured toward the portal as he completed his passage. The dimensional opening constricted rapidly, sealing with a subtle ripple that momentarily distorted the surrounding air, before settling into seamless continuity. "Where are we?" Jack asked, though some newly awakened part of him already sensed. "The answer, the between," Joseph replied, gesturing to their surroundings. "Not quite your world, not quite the spirit realm, a place where different realities overlap and communicate." In this environment, Jack's enhanced perception registered even more detail than before. The land itself seemed semi-sentient, responsive to their presence in subtle ways that manifested as minute energy fluctuations wherever they stood or moved. The hawk totem and cabin were still visible, but transformed, the structure now incorporating elements Jack recognized from ancient Navajo architecture alongside his modern modifications, as if multiple versions of the building existed simultaneously. Most remarkably, the night sky above them displayed constellations entirely unfamiliar to Jack, yet which triggered profound recognition in his deeper consciousness. Star patterns his ancestors had used for navigation and timekeeping for thousands of years before colonial disruption. "We cannot remain here long," Margaret cautioned, her form appearing more vibrant in this realm despite her physical age. "The between sustains visitors only temporarily, unless they're fully initiated into its mysteries." "What about them?" Jack asked, gesturing toward where Dr. Vance and her companions had stood in the ordinary world. In this realm, their vehicles remained visible but transformed into disturbing configurations that only approximately resembled SUVs, more like predatory organisms that mimicked mechanical forms. "They cannot follow directly," Daniel explained, easing Nathan onto a rock formation that accommodated his injured leg with surprising conformity, as if responding to his needs. "Their corrupted nature prevents full manifestation in the between. But they have other methods of pursuit across dimensional boundaries. Which is why we must continue moving," Joseph added. "This is merely the first threshold of many." Jack processed this information while trying to integrate his expanding awareness with his rational understanding. The architect in him noted how this realm followed coherent structural principles despite their deviation from conventional physics, a higher dimensional mathematics that felt increasingly familiar as his consciousness adjusted to the transition. "The hawk totem anchors our return path," Margaret explained, noting Jack's attention on the transformed structure that incorporated his cabin. "When the time comes, it will guide us back to your realm, but changed in ways necessary for what lies ahead." "And what exactly lies ahead?" Jack asked, the enormity of the situation finally penetrating his initial shock. Joseph exchanged glances with Margaret before responding. "A convergence of forces long held separate," he said gravely. "The entities you encountered, what the Dene calls skinwalkers, serve interests that profit from maintaining artificial barriers between worlds. For centuries they've worked to suppress the bridgewalkers who naturally connect realms and maintain cosmic balance. Nathan's research was getting too close to documenting these connection points scientifically," Daniel added, "which is why they targeted him and Kira. By mapping the ancient sites where dimensional barriers naturally thin, he threatened to provide evidence that would legitimize indigenous knowledge in terms Western science couldn't easily dismiss." "But why target me?" Jack questioned. "Until Joseph arrived, I had no connection to any of this." Margaret approached, her expression softening. "You've always been connected, though unaware," she said gently. "Why do you think you were drawn to this particular plot of land? Of all the places you could have chosen for isolation, you selected one of the most significant dimensional crossroads in the Southwest." "The land called to your blood," Joseph confirmed. "The part of you that remembers what your conscious mind forgot. Your DNA ancestors were protectors of this threshold for countless generations before displacement and assimilation scattered the knowledge." The pendant continued to glow against Jack's chest, though with less intense luminosity than during The confrontation. He touched it thoughtfully, feeling its resonance with both this altered landscape and something deep within his own consciousness. "So what happens now?" he asked, the practical aspects of their situation reasserting themselves in his awareness. "We journey deeper into the between," Joseph replied, gathering his walking stick which had transformed in this realm to reveal intricate carvings previously invisible, to a place where Nathan can heal more quickly than in your world, where we can prepare you for what must follow, and where the ancestors who remember the old covenants can be consulted. Kira, who had been examining their surroundings with evident fascination despite their dire circumstances, turned to Jack with unexpected empathy. "It's overwhelming at first," she acknowledged. "When I began accompanying Nathan on his research expeditions, I thought it was all academic theory and cultural metaphor. The first time I experienced a threshold crossing, I questioned my sanity for weeks afterward." "How did you come to accept it?" Jack asked, grateful for her perspective as someone who had navigated a similar conceptual adjustment. "I realized it wasn't about accepting or rejecting, but about expanding my understanding of what's possible," she replied thoughtfully. "The Western scientific tradition I was educated in isn't wrong, just incomplete. It's like trying to understand a forest by studying only the trees while ignoring the mycelial network beneath that connects everything." This analogy resonated with Jack's architectural sensibilities, the recognition that structures existed within larger systems whose principles sometimes operated beyond immediately visible parameters. Throughout his career, he'd intuited connections between built environments and human psychology that his more technically minded colleagues had dismissed as subjective or mystical. "We must move now," Margaret announced, pointing toward a mesa that glowed with subtle luminosity in the distance. "The ancestral council gathers there, alerted by our crossing." As their small party prepared to depart, Jack took a final look at his transformed cabin and the hawk totem standing sentinel beside it. In this realm, the carving emanated visible energy patterns that extended outward to create a protective field around the structure, a physical manifestation of the guardian function Joseph had described. "Will I ever return to my normal life?" Jack asked, the question emerging from the part of him still anchored in ordinary reality. Joseph considered this with evident sympathy. "You will return to your cabin," he confirmed, "but not unchanged, and not to the life you knew before. Once the Bridgewalker awakens, that path cannot be abandoned without consequences for all connected realms." The weight of this statement settled over Jack as they began their journey across the transformed desert, moving toward whatever ancestral wisdom awaited them at the luminous mesa. Behind them, the corrupted vehicles that had brought Dr. Vance and her companions began to dissolve from this reality, returning fully to the ordinary world where their masters would undoubtedly prepare new approaches to their interrupted mission. Jack touched the pendant once more, drawing comfort from its warming presence as they traversed this landscape of infinite possibility and ancient memory. Whatever awaited him, whatever responsibility had been thrust upon him through bloodline and circumstance, he sensed it represented both profound challenge and unexpected homecoming. Part 6. The Restoration. The journey across the Between Realm defied conventional measurements of time and distance. What appeared to be miles passed with the effort of mere yards, while certain stretches extended beyond their visual proportions, requiring sustained focus to traverse. Throughout their progress toward the luminous mesa, Jack's perception continued to adapt, revealing layers of reality invisible to ordinary awareness. Living energy patterns connected all elements of the landscape: plants, stones, air, and earth, engaged in constant communication through luminous filaments, visible only through his enhanced sight. These connections responded to their passage, sometimes facilitating movement when their intentions aligned with the land's natural flows, other times requiring negotiation through rituals Joseph and Margaret performed at particularly dense intersections. Nathan's condition improved remarkably as they traveled. What had been a severe compound fracture in the ordinary world manifested here as an energetic disruption that Margaret treated by manipulating the affected patterns directly. By the time they approached the mesa's base, he walked with only minimal assistance from Daniel, his recovery progressing at impossible speed by conventional medical standards. The between accelerates healing for those with ancestral connections to threshold guardians, Margaret explained when Jack remarked on this transformation. Physical injuries expressed differently here, as energy imbalances rather than material damage. The mesa itself defied ordinary geology. Its structure incorporated elements from multiple time periods simultaneously, ancient seabed formations layered alongside relatively recent volcanic intrusions, with crystalline structures that should have required millions of years to form appearing alongside freshly weathered surfaces. Jack's architectural mind recognized the impossibility of such configurations, while his awakened consciousness accepted their natural expression in this reality. As they began their ascent via a spiraling path that appeared to manifest just ahead of their footsteps, Joseph elaborated on their destination. The Ancestral Council gathers at convergence points where multiple timelines intersect. They exist simultaneously in past, present, and potential futures, maintaining balance between what was, what is, and what might be. Are they actual people? Jack asked, struggling to conceptualize entities that existed across time periods. They were once, in your understanding, Margaret replied. Threshold guardians who completed their physical journeys but chose to remain accessible at dimensional crossroads. Some lived thousands of years ago, others more recently. Their wisdom transcends individual lifespans. The path widened as they neared the summit, opening to a circular plateau approximately 30 yards in diameter. At its center burned a fire unlike any Jack had encountered, flames that shifted through colors beyond the normal spectrum while emitting no smoke, yet providing both illumination and warmth that reached them from a distance. Around this central fire stood 7 stone seats arranged in a perfect circle, each carved from different material ranging from obsidian to turquoise to banded sandstone. 3 of these seats were already occupied by figures whose appearances shifted subtly as Jack observed them, alternating between elderly indigenous individuals in traditional attire and luminous energy forms that approximated human shape without being constrained by ordinary anatomical limitations. The council awaits, Joseph announced, his voice carrying reverence as he approached the circle. They have manifested across significant effort to meet with a newly awakened bridgewalker. Jack felt the pendant warm against his skin, responding to the council's presence. The stone's glow intensified, creating visible connections to each of the seated figures, threads of golden light that established communication beyond verbal exchange. Margaret guided their group to positions around the circle, placing Jack directly opposite the largest gap between occupied seats. Speak truthfully, she advised quietly. They perceive intention as clearly as words. As they settled into place, the remaining 4 seats gradually filled, not with arriving individuals, but through a process of materialization that progressed from ethereal suggestion to defined presence. The completed council represented diverse indigenous nations, their distinctive traditional elements indicating origins spanning the entire North American continent. The figure seated directly across from Jack stabilized into the form of an elderly woman wearing a complex weaving of ceremonial attire that incorporated elements from multiple tribal traditions. When she spoke, her voice resonated on multiple frequencies simultaneously, creating harmonics that conveyed meaning beyond the literal words. Jack Harrison, she acknowledged. Son of Samuel, grandson of William, great-grandson of Thomas, great-great-grandson of Sarah Benali of the Bitterwater clan. The circle completes its turning. The precision of this genealogical recitation, including details Jack himself had never known, eliminated any lingering doubts about the council's nature and knowledge. This was not theatrical performance or elaborate cultural ritual, but direct communication with entities who accessed information across dimensional boundaries. The stone returns to the bloodline, observed another council member, a male figure whose appearance incorporated both Plains and Southwestern traditional elements. 5 generations in the keeping of others, now restored as foretold. Jack touched the pendant reflexively. I don't understand its significance, he admitted, or why it chose me now, after all this time. The stone chooses nothing, replied a third council member whose form shifted between elderly man and young woman with unsettling fluidity. It serves as conduit for energies that respond to specific convergences of bloodline, location, and cosmic timing. The central figure, the elderly woman who had addressed Jack by name, raised one hand in a gesture that quieted the others. You stand at the nexus of multiple critical pathways, she explained. Your architect's understanding of structure, your mixed heritage, connecting worlds that have been artificially separated, your presence on land where dimensional barriers naturally thin, all create conditions for restoration work that becomes possible only once in 7 generations. Restoration of what? Jack asked, sensing they had reached the core purpose of this gathering. The proper relationship between realms, she replied. Before European contact altered the balance, indigenous guardians maintained regular communion between ordinary reality and the spirit dimensions. This communication ensured proper flow of knowledge, healing, and warning between worlds. Another council member continued the explanation. The entities you encountered, those wearing human disguises, serve forces that profit from separation. They systematically eliminated threshold guardians, desecrated sacred sites, and undermined traditional knowledge that maintained healthy connections between realms. These corrupted ones feed on fear, conflict, and spiritual disconnection. Added a figure whose attire suggested Pueblo origins. When worlds communicate naturally, their influence diminishes. When barriers become rigid, their power grows. Jack processed this information through both his rational mind and newly awakened awareness, finding unexpected coherence between scientific understanding and spiritual framework. Like an ecosystem, he suggested. When natural channels of exchange are blocked, imbalance occurs throughout the system. The council members nodded in collective approval of this analogy. The central figure addressed him directly again. You perceive clearly, for one so recently awakened. This gives hope for what must follow. Which is what exactly? Jack asked, still uncertain of his role in this cosmic drama. Joseph stepped forward, joining the conversation as if continuing a dialogue already in progress. The hawk totem at your threshold marks the beginning of restoration work, he explained. Combined with your bloodline connection through the stone, it creates conditions for re-establishing proper communication between worlds at a critical power point. Your cabin stands at the junction of 5 ley lines, Margaret added. Energy pathways that connect sacred sites across vast distances. For centuries, this location hosted structures dedicated to maintaining dimensional harmony, until forced. Relocation scattered the Guardians. Daniel contributed a more contemporary perspective. The entities tracking Nathan and Kira's research understand the scientific implications of documenting these energy convergence points. If modern instruments verify what indigenous traditions have always known about dimensional thresholds, their ability to maintain separation through skepticism and ridicule collapses. The central council figure nodded agreement. The time approaches when ancient knowledge and modern understanding must reconcile. Your unexpected presence at this threshold creates opportunity that our adversaries recognize and fear. Jack considered these revelations, connecting them to his inexplicable draw toward this particular piece of land months earlier. What he had, interpreted as random chance or personal preference, had apparently been guided by deeper forces working through his unconscious connection to ancestral patterns. "What happens now?" he asked, pragmatism asserting itself despite the extraordinary. Context. "I'm no shaman or spiritual leader. I design buildings, or used to anyway." An unexpected ripple of something resembling laughter moved through the council members. "The most effective threshold guardians rarely begin as spiritual specialists," the central figure observed. "They bring practical knowledge from other disciplines that strengthens traditional understanding rather than merely preserving it. Your architectural training serves the restoration work perfectly," another council member elaborated. "You understand how structure influences energy flow, how boundaries can either connect or separate, how form and function must harmonize for sustainability." Margaret approached Jack, her expression both sympathetic and determined. "No one expects you to abandon your previous life or identity," she assured him, "but the awakening cannot be reversed. The bridgewalker within you has stirred and will not return to dormancy. The choice," Joseph added, "is whether you will actively participate in the restoration or merely serve as passive conduit for energies now flowing through your bloodline and land." The council members remained silent, their collective attention focused on Jack as he weighed these alternatives. The pendant pulsed against his skin, its rhythm synchronizing with his heartbeat in a tangible reminder of connections he could no longer ignore or dismiss. His thoughts turned to the life he had left behind in Phoenix, the architectural career. Derailed by economic collapse, the marriage dissolved under financial pressure, the identity constructed around professional success and material acquisition. That path had ended in bitter isolation, driving him to retreat to the desert where, ironically, he had found unexpected connection to forces and traditions his previous worldview would have rejected as primitive superstition. "If I agree to participate," Jack said finally, "what exactly would be required of me?" The central council figure raised both hands, palms forward in a gesture of clarification. "Not conversion or abandonment of your existing knowledge," she emphasized, "rather integration and expansion. The Threshold Guardian's primary responsibility is maintaining balanced communication between realms, preventing either excessive separation or dangerous collapse of necessary boundaries." "In practical terms," Joseph explained, "this means learning traditional protocols for dimensional interactions while bringing your contemporary understanding to these practices. The Hawk Totem serves as primary anchor point, creating protected space for controlled threshold work." "You wouldn't be alone in this," Margaret assured him. "The awakening of a new guardian activates a support network spanning both ordinary and spirit realms." Daniel gestured toward Nathan and Kira. "Their research documenting threshold points creates academic legitimacy that protects traditional practices from dismissal. My position within the Park Service provides institutional support and access to sites requiring protection. Joseph and Margaret offer traditional knowledge and connection to community resources. A modern approach to ancient responsibility," the Central Council figure summarized. "Adaptation has always been essential to survival." As Jack considered this proposition, the fire at the center of the circle flared suddenly higher, its flames shifting to deep indigo. The council members turned their attention toward it with evident concern, communicating among themselves in modalities that transcended ordinary language. "They have found a different approach," the central figure announced grimly. "The corrupted." One's attempt to collapse the dimensional barrier at your threshold by destabilizing the anchor points in the material realm. Joseph rose immediately. "The totem," he said. "They attack the physical anchor." Through some connection established by the pendant, Jack perceived the situation instantly. Dr. Vance and her companions had returned to his cabin with reinforcements, bringing equipment designed to disrupt the energetic protections anchored by the hawk totem. The visualization was so vivid, it momentarily displaced his awareness of the council circle, transporting his perception back to the snow-covered landscape surrounding his cabin. "We must return immediately," Margaret declared, already gathering herself for transit between realms. If they destroy the totem before proper reinforcement, the threshold could collapse chaotically, creating unpredictable effects across multiple dimensions. The council members rose in unison, their forms becoming increasingly luminous as they channeled energy toward the group. "We will stabilize the between pathway," the central figure stated, "but the confrontation must occur in the material realm where they have chosen to make their stand." Joseph turned to Jack, his expression conveying both urgency and confidence. "The pendant will guide your actions," he instructed. "Trust what it shows you, even when your logical mind resists." Daniel helped Nathan to his feet, while Kira gathered, close to her grandmother. "The return journey compresses differently than the outward path," Margaret warned. "Prepare for disorientation as we transition." The council members had now linked hands, creating a circle of intensifying luminosity around the central fire. As their energy built toward critical threshold, the flames transformed into a vertical column that expanded outward to envelop Jack's group in swirling patterns of light. The transition occurred with disorienting suddenness, reality seeming to fold inward before explosively reconstituting around them. Jack experienced a momentary sensation of existing simultaneously in multiple locations before his awareness snapped back into singular focus at the precise location where their journey had begun, the threshold of his cabin. They materialized. On the porch, facing an expanded group of adversaries, Dr. Vance, surrounded now by 8 companions whose human disguises appeared increasingly unstable, flickering between conventional appearance and disturbing alternatives as they worked to dismantle the energetic protections anchored by the hawk totem. 2 of them had positioned what resembled scientific instruments around the carving, generating interference patterns that disrupted its connection to both the pendant and the broader dimensional framework it maintained. The totem itself had begun to deteriorate, its intricate carvings fading as if being erased from reality rather than physically damaged. "Stop them," Joseph urged as their group fully materialized. "If the anchor point collapses completely, the damage extends across multiple realms." Jack stepped forward instinctively, the pendant flaring with renewed intensity as he moved toward the endangered totem. Dr. Vance noticed their arrival immediately, her false human features contorting with frustration. "Too late, Bridgewalker," she called, her voice fluctuating between human speech and something altogether alien. "The severance has already begun. Your precious threshold will collapse into chaos, eliminating this connection point permanently." The dye pendant burned against Jack's skin with almost painful intensity, conveying urgent information beyond verbal communication. Through its connection, he understood precisely what was happening, and more importantly, how to counter it. The equipment generating interference operated on principles similar to noise cancellation technology, producing energy patterns specifically designed to neutralize the totem's dimensional frequencies. But like all wave-based systems, it could be disrupted through strategic phase shifting, generating complementary frequencies that would reinforce rather than cancel the totem's emanations. Jack moved with sudden determination toward the nearest device, his architect's understanding of structural relationships combining with newly awakened awareness of energetic principles. The pendant's connection guided his hands as he adjusted the equipment's orientation, shifting its relationship to the totem in ways that transformed its disruptive effect into supportive resonance. "Stop him!" Dr. Vance commanded, but her companions' reactions came too slowly. Joseph, Margaret, and Daniel had positioned themselves strategically around the property, establishing a secondary protective boundary that constrained the entity's movements. Kira and Nathan, despite their recent ordeal, contributed to this effort with practiced coordination that suggested previous experience with such confrontations. As Jack completed the reconfiguration of the first device, its energy output visibly transformed, shifting from disruptive interference to amplification that actually strengthened the totem's dimensional anchoring. The carving's features began to restabilize, its connection to the pendant intensifying rather than diminishing. "Impossible," hissed one of Dr. Vance's companions, his human disguise faltering to reveal glimpses of something reptilian beneath. "He cannot understand the technology enough to reverse its function." "He doesn't need to understand your technology," Margaret called from her position. "Only the principles it manipulates, which are far older than your devices." Jack moved to the second piece of equipment, the pendant now providing clear guidance for the necessary adjustments. As he worked, the dimensional energies around the cabin began to rebalance, the disruption giving way to more stable configuration that actually strengthened the threshold's integrity beyond its previous state. Dr. Vance recognized the failing strategy, signaling her companions to abandon the equipment and retreat toward their vehicles. "This site is lost," she announced with cold pragmatism. "We withdraw to secondary containment protocols." As the entities retreated, their human disguises deteriorating further with each step away from the equipment they had abandoned, Joseph approached Jack at the totem. "Complete the restoration," he instructed. "The pendant will show you how." Jack placed one hand on the hawk carving, the other on the pendant at his throat. The connection between them surged with renewed power, creating visible manifestation of energy that extended outward to encompass the entire property in a protective lattice far more complex and resilient than the original boundary. Through this connection, Jack perceived the dimensional structure of his land with unprecedented clarity. The 5 converging ley lines Joseph had mentioned, the natural thinning of barriers between ordinary reality and the spirit realm, the historical resonance of countless ceremonies performed at this location over thousands of years. His architect's mind recognized this energetic architecture as elegantly functional design, maintaining necessary separation while allowing controlled communication between realms. As the protective lattice stabilized, the hawk totem transformed, not physically, but energetically. Additional layers of complex patterning became visible through Jack's enhanced perception, revealing the carving's true nature as sophisticated interdimensional technology disguised as traditional art. These patterns extended throughout his property, connecting to underground water sources, specific rock formations, and plant communities in a comprehensive system that had existed long before his cabin was built. "It's incredible," Jack murmured, overwhelmed by the complexity and beauty of what he now perceived. "This has been here all along?" "Dormant but not dead," Joseph confirmed, "waiting for the right conditions to reactivate. Your arrival, the pendant's return to the bloodline, my finding you during the storm, all necessary components for restoring what was deliberately disabled generations ago." The entities had retreated completely, their vehicles departing with unnatural speed down the snow-covered access road. Margaret joined them at the totem, her expression reflecting both satisfaction and awareness of continuing challenges. "They will return with different approaches," she cautioned. "Today's victory secures this threshold temporarily, but the larger conflict continues across many fronts." "At least we've established a protected base," Daniel observed, surveying the reinforced energetic boundary with professional appreciation, and documented another attempt at dimensional interference that matches patterns at other sites. Nathan, now moving with only minimal evidence of his recent injury, examined the abandoned equipment with scholarly interest. This technology combines advanced quantum principles with corrupted versions of traditional knowledge, he noted. Perfect research material for demonstrating the scientific basis of indigenous dimensional understanding. As their immediate danger receded, Jack's awareness began to integrate his expanded perception with more ordinary consciousness. The pendant's glow subsided to subtle luminescence, while his vision gradually adjusted to incorporate both enhanced awareness and conventional sight simultaneously, a balanced perspective that Joseph had described as the bridgewalker's natural state. "What happens now?" Jack asked, the enormity of the day's revelations and experiences finally registering fully. "You rest," Margaret said practically. "The first awakening demands significant energy. Tomorrow begins the learning process, understanding your role as threshold guardian and integrating that responsibility with your existing life. You'll need to strengthen the site's protections," Joseph added. "Establish proper protocols for controlled communication between realms. Learn to recognize different types of entities and their intentions. And document everything," Nathan suggested enthusiastically. "Your unique position as someone with both indigenous heritage and scientific training makes your observations incredibly valuable for bridging these knowledge systems." The suggestion resonated with Jack's architectural instincts, the possibility of designing not just physical structures, but energetic ones, creating spaces that facilitated healthy interaction between dimensions rather than rigid separation or dangerous collapse. As dawn approached, painting the snow-covered landscape with golden light, their group gathered on the porch to witness the sunrise from their protected sanctuary. The hawk totem stood restored beside the door, its carved eyes catching the first rays with surprising reflectivity. "Your ancestor who last wore that pendant was also an architect of sorts," Margaret told Jack quietly. "He designed trading posts that incorporated traditional knowledge into seemingly Western structures, creating spaces where different worlds could meet in balanced exchange." The parallel struck Jack as both coincidental and somehow inevitable, the continuation of family, pattern across generations, expressing similar purpose through evolving forms appropriate to changing times. Joseph gestured toward the hawk totem, now fully restored and pulsing with renewed energy. "The old ones say that when you share fire with a wandering stranger, you never know whether you're hosting an ordinary traveler or a messenger between worlds," he observed with quiet satisfaction. "It seems you provided shelter to the right visitor at precisely the right moment." As the rising sun illuminated the desert, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a canvas of extraordinary beauty, Jack felt the pendant warm gently against his skin, no longer the urgent heat of awakening or confrontation, but the comfortable resonance of rightness and belonging. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever entities might return with new strategies for maintaining separation between worlds, he had found something he hadn't even known he was seeking when he retreated to this isolated piece of desert. Not escape from connection, but its deeper expression. Not solitude, but integration with traditions and responsibilities that extended far beyond individual identity. The hawk totem caught the morning light, casting a shadow that briefly took the form of wings, extending protectively over the threshold of his cabin, a silent affirmation of his unexpected role as guardian of this sacred meeting place between worlds. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.